Hey, happy Friday. We are hopping on here for another Facebook Live. I don't know if you knew, but it's actually Balance Awareness Week. And I didn't even know this myself until the Vestibular Disorders Association sent me something about it a few months ago, actually. But what I thought was really cool was the Vestibular Disorders Association is an awesome association, by the way. They are really proactive in educating people about balance, about the vestibular system, the impact of balance, preventing falls, all of those things, which is such a big part of what we do as physical therapists. So I'm Julie Hirschberg, the owner of Re+active Physical Therapy, and here it's our mission to help people with neurologic diagnoses recover movement, strength, and confidence, and doing this in a way that really aims to change the brain. And we do this with one-on-one physical therapy, occupational therapy, personal training, yoga therapy, group exercise, and we do a lot of education with other healthcare providers. And this is part of that. When we think about some of the big questions and topics that come up for us every week in the clinic and in our movement disorders fellowship, balance, the vestibular system, and some of these really less known diagnoses or more rare diagnoses that we work with a lot. The vestibular system is actually a common thread, and the neuro nerd side of me finds it really fascinating and interesting, and I get curious about what is that common thread and what does it mean in these different disorders. So each of the disorders that we're going to talk about today, we have had discussions on just individually. So we're just going to touch on a little, vestibular piece of them, but we'll talk a little bit about dystonia, functional movement disorders, chronic pain, and concussion. And it's so interesting that there's this common thread between those. And then we'll talk at the end how to maybe limit this incidence of vestibular dysfunction, maybe prevent it, and then improve it. Because here's the good news is, as physical therapists who do vestibular rehabilitation, we can actually resolve dizziness and balance problems. So let's start with talking about overall, when we talk about the vestibular system and vestibular dysfunction, it is so common. In adults, most over the age of 40, and in a pretty recent study, they found that about 35% of people actually have some vestibular dysfunction. That's a lot of people. That's like 70 million people in the US alone. So that's a lot of people. And what we know about the vestibular system, when you have a dysfunction, it puts you at a higher risk of falls and tends to really change your life. And I can speak to this very specifically because I recently had a vestibular neuritis and BPPV, and it changed what I was doing. So clearly it's a huge problem, and it is something that we see alongside or causing or contributing to several different disorders. The hard part is often to understand whether it is the chicken or the egg, right? So like, did it cause it or is it because of it? And we'll talk a little bit about that with each disorders. And dystonia is something I'm super passionate about. So I wanted to start with that one. It's something that we do see a lot at Re+active, and in cervical dystonia especially, the vestibular system has been implicated in potentially the onset, but certainly the ongoing problem. It's potentially that some change in the vestibular system is causing the wrong sensory input. So for example, if you think about maybe one vestibular nerve or vestibular apparatus firing different from the other, it could actually cause a change in your eye position and your head in order to make things seem even again. So that's kind of a simplified example of that. There's actually been some research to show that people who have cervical dystonia may actually have had a vestibular hypofunction that was like a trigger of it or the start of it. The other thing that can really happen in cervical dystonia is co-contraction of the muscles around the neck in order to try to hold the neck still. And that decrease in mobility and not turning the head as much can actually also lead to dysfunction in the vestibular system, and definitely underuse of the vestibular system. And I guess I like to think of the vestibular system kind of like a move it or lose it kind of thing. And you might notice this, I noticed this myself, before I had kids, it's not that often that I was on like a swing or something like that. And then when I had kids, I was going on the swings with them. And the first few times it was like, whoa, I'm really sensitive to this motion, right? And then, you know, after doing it a bunch, it was tolerable and my vestibular system got attuned to it. So that, you know, the vestibular system needs that head and body movement to stay in tune. So that'll be part of our treatment too, is just keep moving, but there is a good way to do it. Some of the studies in cervical dystonia also have suggested that there might be some like abnormal or reweighted central processing of the signals from the vestibular system. So, you know, when we think of the vestibular system, we think of the peripheral, and I think that's what most people think of, like the inner ear, the nerve, but then all of that is integrated in the central vestibular system. And so it has been found that in cervical dystonia, there might be some abnormal processing of the signals, as well as some abnormal processing from the cervical muscles, which makes sense because they're involved. And so the brain, as it's processing it, may actually ignore or even down-regulate some of the signals because they're unreliable. So that may then be something that we turn into the treatment. Now, as I tend to kind of dive down some rabbit holes with this information, but I found this really interesting article where they actually stimulated some of the different connections to the vestibular nuclei centrally. And so looking at, I hadn't even heard of this, and I've been helping out neuroanatomy for like 10 years. It was the interstitial nucleus of Cajal. I hadn't even heard of that, but it's closely connected to the vestibular nuclei, which I had heard of. It actually has inputs to the sternocleidomastoid muscles through those motor regions in the brainstem, and stimulating it can actually produce head rotation, which is pretty interesting and may be one of the underlying issues in cervical dystonia. So it's something that we test for sure to see if it's underlying issue, and then treat it, which is, you know, awesome. Okay, so let's take a shift to functional movement disorders. And there's a similarity here with dystonia in that there may be an underlying problem. It might even be the initial trigger of the movement disorder. And in fact, a functional neurologic disorder called 3PD is actually a functional dizziness or functional vestibular disorder in and of itself. There also can be, in the functional movement disorder, a similar piece to dystonia, which is the potential for that underlying mismatch occurring between the anticipated motion and the actual motion. And as we've talked before, when we talk functional movement disorders, this can occur due to the impaired self-agency as well as the abnormal self-attention. So that affects the vestibular system as well. Third is concussion. Now, we had to talk about concussion today because it's also a Concussion Awareness Day today, September 20th. And there is so much we could talk about because there's a whole host of vestibular issues related to the initial injury and the post-concussion journey with this. And, you know, even if we only looked at like sports-related concussions, there's a lot of data out there. Most athletes, most young adults will report dizziness after the concussion. That's like up to 84%, so it's a lot. And the other is that when there are those vestibular symptoms, they tend to indicate that there might be a more prolonged recovery. So this is certainly something that we want to screen for and treat as well. You know, if we think about getting people back to life, getting people back to sport, we want to, you know, limit that time, decrease that time if possible, but having the vestibular component prolongs that time. So I think that is, that's really important. I think it speaks to the extent of what that potential injury is. So in a concussion, that injury could be peripheral and like mechanical, like a BPPV type of thing, but it could also be central, like some white matter shearing due to the concussion, maybe a vestibular migraine, or maybe both, and that can make it really tricky to tease out. I think, you know, really in those cases, having a vestibular trained therapist is so important to tease out those pieces and treat it early on as well. We work with a lot of people with post-concussion syndrome, and this is a part that maybe had been never been tested and treated, and so those symptoms have been really prolonged, and I'm an advocate for early testing, early treatment. So the fourth disorder that we were talking about with vestibular connections was chronic pain. And why in the world does this come up? It's not as obviously related. And you know, this actually came up because I was doing some research for the weekend course that we're hosting soon. I'll talk about that at the end. We're doing a focal dystonia CRPS course, and we're talking about a lot of connections between these different diseases from a neurophysiological standpoint. And I came across this article, and it was an article looking at underlying vestibular dysfunction in people who were treated for chronic pain. And they did a whole host of vestibular testing and found that 66.9% of people with chronic pain also had an underlying vestibular disorder. That was so interesting to me. Like, why would we have that? And there's certainly some things I could think of, like theoretically, clinically, but I had to dive into some literature here, and I found this really, really interesting. So there are some connections to maybe other parts of the brain. So they've looked at the insula, the insular cortex, and have found that that might play an important role in building the idea of the body state and where you are maybe in space, and that it is known that in chronic pain there's this like abnormal body perception. Now that they do functional type brain imaging, these now show that insula cortex modulates the vestibular activity in the brainstem. And that may be the link between that like chronic pain to vestibular, maybe through the insula, which is really, really fascinating. So there was a recent study that that looked at this, and they also then did a series of vestibular tests like EMG and things like that, and found a symmetrical vestibular pattern of activity. And like so fascinating. They, you know, clinically, what I think of too is that if you are in a condition of chronic pain, and especially neck pain, but anywhere that the way you're moving has changed. And this is probably one of those connections that is between all of them. Decreased movement, change in movement that's leading to changes in your sensory system, impaired proprioception, overall changing the sensory input. It's a connection between all of these disorders in the vestibular system. And the vestibular system is like multimodal. It's involved in so many functions, like included our reflexes and our perception, our consciousness even. It's way more complex than I ever realized when I first learned about it. And the reflexes, like the vestibulospinal, vestibular ocular, so between kind of controlling our body, the spine, and our eyes with our head movements, these are so essential to our daily lives. So when things change, those are changing. And this, when we think about dystonia, functional movement disorders with those altered connections, chronic pain with those altered connections as well, and concussion, all of these are about connections. And brain function, spinal cord function, vestibular function are quite interdependent. And I think that's why we see it as a component of all of those. One other piece that we also know is just the overall nervous system sensitivity. And one thing then that we may be doing is actually trying to change the nervous system sensitivity. Thinking about those connections between the vestibular system and the autonomic nervous system, for example. So that sympathetic drive, that excitation, in all of these disorders, and in many things I think that we work with at Re+active, we are looking to assess that autonomic function and then retune it. To decrease that excitation, because that certainly influences the vestibular system and decreases that ability for that neuroplasticity to occur. And the last piece, which I really mentioned before, was the move it to not lose it idea. And what I hinted at earlier was that you can't just dive in, especially with a more chronic condition. But even without that, like if you have vestibular dysfunction, if you have dizziness, and any of the disorders that we talked about, or even without that, it's a graded exposure approach that is really needed to be able to expose the system and have that challenge be at just the right level in order to succeed and not overwhelm the system, which I know I certainly did when I was doing my own rehab. I overwhelmed the system to where I had like terrible headaches and neck pain because I did too much. And so having that graded exposure approach, which is exactly what we're going to talk about in our Facebook Live next week, by the way, it's something that actually can apply to really all of neurology and in a lot of our interventions, but especially when we talk about things like dystonia and chronic pain, concussion, functional movement disorders. That graded exposure approach is so important, and it's how you can get your life back without overwhelming it. So stay tuned for next week, because we'll talk about some of the concepts that go with that. And there you have it. So we talked about the vestibular system, how common vestibular dysfunction is. We talked about the implications for vestibular with dystonia, functional movement disorders, chronic pain, and concussion. So 4 disorders that are very different but have this similarity of altered connections within the brain. And really then what I talked about, so like limiting, preventing vestibular dysfunction and improving balance, is move it or lose it, but not overdo it. It needs this graded exposure, especially if it's been there for a long time, in any of those disorders, to regain life, regain balance, and get rid of that dizziness. So thanks so much for joining us today. If you are interested in more, we would love for you to join our education list, where we share a lot of our free resources, and you can find that at reactivept.com/education. And if you really like these topics, so these interesting disorders, and kind of diving into figure out what is the connection and how can I help people to become successful and regain their lives with it, I would love to invite you to our course. We have our Focal Dystonia and CRPS course coming up in October. It's October 12th and 13th. It's with myself, Brittany Kim, who's an orthopedic specialist, Ellen Wu, who's a movement disorder neurologist, and Laura Ettinger, who's a neurologist and pain management specialist. So it's quite the team. I feel really honored to be a part of it, to be honest. And it's going to be very hands-on, very practical learning with the whole team. So if you go to our education page, actually, there'll be a link right there to find out more, and certainly email me if you have questions, but we'd love to have you there. And we'll see you next week.